This is Generous Theology, and today Chuck and Brock are taking a look at Professor Richard Muller's magnum opus, his Post Reformation Reformed Dogmatics, which is now available to freely read online.
Chuck, if you came over and I said, aha, you're guilty, and you said, wait a minute, I'm not guilty. And I said back to you, haha, the very fact that you're making such protestations about not being guilty is exactly the kind of thing a guilty person would do. And that's where we are with a lot of these relationships now. And I wondered if you had seen that. I wondered if the circles you'd had run into some of these tensions, some of these issues. What does it look like from your point of view?
Yeah, it seems to me, I often feel a little bit like an outsider in some of these discussions. And I don't know whether that is a function of my branch of folks really being scholastic, which I think, or anti-scholastic, or however you want to put it. And there is a sense in which I know that in my branch of the Reformed world, we're aware of people like Turretin and some of the others but often those aren't the guys we're reading. And so there is a sense in which at least the high scholasticism isn't part of our DNA. I'm not sure it's not, the reason that it's not part of our DNA is so much out of being opposed. Rather, I think there is a sense, and I say this carefully because I'm sure there will be, I know there are people who disagree with my take on this, but I do feel that generally there is more give in the three forms of unity, Dort, the Belgic Confession, the Heidelberg Catechism, on some of these issues than there is in Westminster, and as a result, the London Baptist Confession, or at least those parts of the London Baptist Confession that are in essence taken directly from Westminster. And the Westminster divines did go. There's general agreement between those sets of, especially between Westminster and the three forms, on certain issues of theology and on issues of theology that were important at the time of the Reformation and during Calvin, things like soteriology and things like that. I do think that the three forms were written in a way that allowed for a little broader unity on things. And as a result, some of those fights that we see in what us Dutch Reformed people call Presbyterianism, they're just as Reformed as we are, but we sometimes like to call them Presbyterians and us Formed. But that's just another one of those, who's in the club and who's not. But I think there is a sense that some of those battles that go on among those folks have not so much occurred in my branch of the Reformed world. Now, I will say that there are some people who would say that there's a negative in that. I know that there are some people who feel that, for example, the Institute for Christian Studies in Toronto, there's a lot of people in the Reform world who say they've gone beyond the pale, because there are some people who have taught and studied there who stretched that idea, the idea of what is Reformed, even further. But that's all a way of saying that I'm not sure so much whether it's that my branch is anti-scholastic, that I haven't heard about a lot of these fights, or maybe it's because our branch is a little more, a little more open to some things, both positively and negative, that there haven't been the big fight. The big fights that occurred in sort of our circles started out with things like common grace and those kinds of things, and in more recent years have really been more about practical ecclesiological issues rather than more deeply theological, to the point where some people complain that our synod often deals with ecclesiastical issues and ecclesiology issues, but has not done a lot on theology. And so where we've been asked to more recently, there's some question about A, how well it's been done, B, even where it has been done, was it done some of the other traditions in mind, to the point where I know that some of our writing, some issues often get misunderstood because we're talking to each other and not necessarily talking to others, including others in the Reformed world. And so I know there's been some level of that.
Yeah, great point. So I would throw out here that Muller's 4 volumes should really be in any serious Reformed student's library. If you're saying to yourself, I want to have a library of great Reformed works, then I think Muller's 4 volumes, Calvin's Institutes, Bavinck's, and Voss's Reformed Dogmatics. I would put Frame's works of theology. I would put lots of other works in there too. And maybe that's worth talking about one day, maybe just coming up with a list of these seminal resources and these seminal reads. And the idea here is to not name everything and to try to not leave major things out. Think of a seminary in 50 to 100 books, for example. So if you were going to design just 100 books for the serious student to get and have as their crown jewels, what would those be? That would be a really fun exercise. And I think we would love to probably engage with folks over what they find to be some of the most interesting and valuable works as well. So not putting you on the spot, Chuck, and asking you to necessarily flesh out, but what are some of the seminal reads that you think are really important and matter to somebody who wants to really, quote unquote, get it when it comes to Reformed theology?
Yeah, I actually have a list. I'm going to try to find it while talking of some really good theology books that I think fit that. But while I'm looking for that, I start with the common ones, the ones that everybody agrees are good. And that includes Bavinck's Reformed Dogmatics, includes some of the other B's, the Compendium of the Christian Faith and the Manual of Christian Doctrine. And then moving forward, there is a theology book by Gordon Spikeman, and I'm going to pick it up here. I often refer to it. It's called Reformational Theology, a New Paradigm for Doing Dogmatics, and I really appreciate that one. Some of the other places that I go, and this is not necessarily simply in terms of theology per se, but also worldview and philosophy. I think, for example, there is an excellent book. It's the first right when I'm trying to think of it, but it's Al Walter's. Creation Regained. Creation Regained by Al Walter is an excellent resource. A couple others, I haven't gone through all of them, but have been highly recommended to me. Craig Bartholomew has written a number of books. One where he outlines the theological and philosophical tradition called Contours of the Kuyperian Tradition. He's written a book on introducing biblical hermeneutics. There's a whole series of books by Abraham Kuyper is being put out by the Kuyper Translation Society, one on common grace. I'm reading with a group of people online a book called Our Program, which is more political, and it deals with the political program that Kuyper was pitching to folks in the Netherlands in the late 1800s. There is another one that is quite new that I have not actually read yet, but I'm hoping to in the near future, is one called Reformed Public Theology by Matthew Kamink. That's because public theology is an interest in how theology engages with the philosophy of society and how church relates to the world. That's one that I'm really interested in as well. And there's a whole bunch more. I know there. I actually somewhere have a link to that list of books. I'll put it in the chat when I find it here, even after we finish tonight, so that you have it and you can add it to a resource that people may be able to look into in the future. But yeah, those are some of the ones that I'm thinking.
Amen. Said. I would just say that there's probably something positive to be accomplished by engaging, by in some sense having an intra-reformed apologetic. So in other words, it's now fairly clear to me that even talking amongst ourselves, because of the heuristic nature of many of the interactions, coming historically from the hyper-Calvinist camp, and I would say in the contemporary fashion also coming largely from a certain segment of the classical theist camp. In one sense, we almost have to become apologists intramurally for our own Reformed tradition, because there's going to be someone out in the marketplace of ideas who wants to point the finger and say, you're not in the club. And in one sense, maybe it's good to articulate the identity to which one associates. But I have to say, there's also a very negative long-term outlook here. It's bad news if we Calvinists can't even get along with ourselves. And I say bad news in the sense of going out and capturing the minds of a new generation, not necessarily winning, quote unquote, converts to Calvinism, but just even putting forward a fair perspective as to what we're thinking. Because most of what happens in the popular places where people interact and talk about these things, partisanship dominates, and accusation is a cheap and effective currency. And part of my own interest in this is I come out of some wars, some intra Reformed wars. I was associated with one of the camps in a denomination, the non-classical theist camp, that was kicked out, that was booted out of the denomination because the denomination, which had previously allowed non-classical theists to fellowship and associate, later adopted those stricter standards. Now, those stricter standards were, at first, when they were first proposed, I was for them because the standards were about locking out the moderns, locking out process theologians, locking out open theists, responding to groups that were really different and distinct from Reformed theology. And then somewhere, it horrified me to find out the quote-unquote enemy they were pointing their guns at more and more often weren't really any of these external parties, but they were in fact pointing their gun at me. And I wouldn't say that I'm particularly inclusivistic in a modern sense, but I'll tell you what, you'll get kicked out of somebody's club that thought, hey, I'm with my brother here, and they turn and look at you and say, you're no brother of mine. And it's quite striking. And so in one sense, if the Reformed camps are at each other's throats, the old saying, a house divided against itself cannot stand. And for me, that is actually one of the long-term negatives for my outlook for the status of Reformed theology. Now, it's not, of course, that's just a human analysis. God is welcome to change hearts as he sees fit, and I hope and pray that he will. But from a human perspective, we're just going at each other, attacking each other, at each other's throats, having this rabid tyranny of minor differences, tyranny of secondary differences. And it's so destructive, Chuck. If you've ever read Psalm 133, it talks about how wonderful it is when God's people live together, live in unity. It's like the oil flowing down Aaron's beard. The idea is that this is something that the Lord really rejoices in, and it really gives him great pleasure when his children live together in harmony and peace. And I feel like that's threatened here. And I don't even think it makes sense to position Reformed theology to engage in the culture when our house is in such bad array. I don't think that there's going to be any appeal to it. Our Aristicism is concerning. And I say our, of course, there are lots of Reformed folks who are above that sort of thing. But there are lots of folks who aren't. And unfortunately, in the theology wars, Calvinists have a really bad name. And I don't see it getting better anytime soon. And so that's why I want to have, even though I'm not a classical theist, that's why I want to have Muller in my library. I want to read him. I want to learn from him. I want to understand what he's thinking and why he's thinking, and let the scholarship rise. Let the cream rise to the top. So those are my 2 cents on that, Chuck. Let me throw it over to you maybe for the last word here for this session.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. We need to have discussions. There's a sense in which sometimes we say iron sharpens iron, but yeah, iron sharpens iron only if the iron swords are rubbing up against each other. We're stabbing them into people's soft body parts. That's not sharpening iron any. So I think we have to be careful about that. Instead of sticking those swords into people, we think of it a different way. Maybe it is that sort of fencing duel where, yeah, we're putting people on each other's guard and we're making some of our own points. But yeah, the point isn't utter victory. The point is growth, learning. And really the point is bringing glory to God. That's really the point of our lives. That's our primary purpose here on earth, is glorify God. We should be doing that in our discussions, our quote-unquote argument. And there's a real sense in which if we spend all our time eating each other, that's the other thing. If we're fighting amongst each other, how are we going to make our case to the rest of the world?
Amen. Thank you for a beautiful discussion, as always. I hit you at last moment and without warning with a pretty deep topic, and you really had to respond here cold. And I appreciate what you had to say with it, and I thank you for it, even in the face of not having any chance to prepare or think about it ahead of time.